Hello, in this video we're still talking about pseudocode and we're going to look at this thing called a selection. So let's say, for instance, that I have the name and I have got that from an input from the user and the question was, what is your name? There we go. So, what is your name? Now, what I can say is if, and this is how I start it, then I write the name of the variable, or I'm actually essentially constructing a test. It could be constructed with all sorts of things. If name equals, and I'm expressing now, some people say in pseudocode you can use a single equals, or you can use a double to mean the same thing, because this one up here is what we use to assign. So we don't use the equals for that. Just to be perfectly clear, I always use the double so that it's saying, is it true that these things equal? It's a question, not a statement. So, if name equals Mark, then, and then I end my if statement with end if, and this stuff inside only happens if you pass the test. So, I'm going to indent a couple of times in this program. Lots of programs you can just hit tab once. Doesn't really matter, as long as it's indented. So that improves readability, and it says that this only happens within that situation. So I'm going to print hello Mark. So if I am reading this, let's maybe just stop talking for a second. So I know that the name comes from whatever the user types in. Well, let's assume they typed in Mark. So if that variable is the same as Mark, then I'm going to do that thing that's indented. And then the end of the if. So if I were to write on the end, print welcome, well, that welcome is going to print whatever they type in. That's not within the loop. It's not indented and it's not captured by this if and this end if. So that is not part of the selection, that's just part of the code. So that's how an if statement works. Now, I could also say, what if their name does not equal Mark? Well, if their name does not equal Mark, then I'm just going to say hello person. So I can test for it. Well, I can test with other mathematical operators. Is this less than that? Is this greater than this? Does this equal this? All sorts of things can go in the condition, but that's where the condition goes, between the if and the then. All right, let's talk about a slightly more complicated use of this. So I'm going to say if name equals Mark, so that's equals equals, then I say hello Mark. Well, what I can also do down here is I can use an else statement, just like that. Now this is also indented because now this only happens if the test fails. So else print hello person. There we go. So let's run this through in our head. I run it through and the person writes in Barry. Well, if name equals Mark, well, it doesn't equal Mark, so we're not going to run that. Else, well, yeah, it is an else because it didn't pass that test. Then we get the else condition and it says hello person, and then it will say welcome. So that's what happens with the input of Barry. Here's the final state of this. I can actually have an if and an if-else statement. So an if-else is like a second thing that I'm testing for. So if name equals Barry, then, and then what happens goes in there. So it's like asking two, and it can be 50 if questions, and then else if they've passed none of those. So we're going to print hello Barry. There we go. So I run my program. They type in Mark. If, yes, it does equal Mark, so I print that. It doesn't do the if else, and it doesn't do the else, because it passed this test. So, hello Mark, and then welcome. Alright, let's type in Barry up here. So we type in Barry, fails that test, passes that test, so it says hello Barry, and so it doesn't need to do that because it's passed one of the tests. There you go. So let's say we type in hello Kevin. Now this is not Kevin standing next to me. We fail that test, and so we end up with that one. So that's how a selection works.